Felix Vallotton, Part 1. Imagine this. A quiet room in Paris, 1890s. A man sits by the window, staring not at the light but at the shadows it casts. His hand moves, not with the frenzy of passion but with the precision of a surgeon. Each line, each block of black ink on white paper is deliberate, merciless. That man was Felix Vallotton, a Swiss outsider who would one day be called the cold eye of modern art. But here's the twist. Unlike his contemporaries in the warm haze of Impressionism, Vallotton painted not light, but truth. Brutal, unflinching truth. The kind of truth that made his works feel almost dangerous. And perhaps, hidden within every print, every painting, was his own secret. A lifelong struggle between belonging and isolation, tenderness and cruelty, the warmth of humanity and the sharp chill of detachment. Childhood and early years. Felix Vallotton was born in Lausanne, Switzerland in 1865. His father was a conservative pharmacist, his mother a deeply religious woman. They hoped their son might take a practical path. But even as a boy, Vallotton's eyes lingered where others looked away. He watched the world as if through glass, detached, analytical, almost scientific. Where another child might sketch a bird in flight, Felix would draw the shadows its wings carved across the wall. At school he was a misfit. Too quiet. Too intense. Teachers found him brilliant but unsettling. One remarked, "Vallotton looks at people not as children look at friends, but as an anatomist studies corpses." By his teenage years, Felix was restless. The sleepy Swiss town of Lausanne could not contain his hunger. He wanted art, not the polite sketches of bourgeois Switzerland, but the raw intensity of Paris, the beating heart of modernity. And so, at just 16 he left. Paris, the outsider arrives. Imagine Paris in the 1880s. Cafés alive with smoke and philosophy. The air vibrating with the brushstrokes of Monet, Renoir, Degas. The city exploding with color, with sensation, with light. And into this maelstrom walked Vallotton, pale, reserved, dressed with the neatness of a bank clerk. He didn't drink heavily, didn't shout his ideas across tables. He simply observed. Always observing. He entered the Académie Julian, one of the great art schools of the time. There, students rushed to mimic the Impressionists, to paint with fever, with emotion, with blur and shimmer. But Vallotton refused. He painted stillness. He painted clarity. He painted with an icy hand that seemed to strip away illusion. In 1885, still just a young student, Vallotton painted a portrait of Jean Reno, a family friend. When exhibited at the Salon, critics were stunned. The painting was compared to Hans Holbein, the Renaissance master of precision. They called him the Little Holbein of Paris. For a moment, success seemed to arrive early. But behind that success, something darker stirred. Because Vallotton was beginning to see, truly see, not just faces but the hidden dramas beneath them. The tension of couples in silence. The suspicion between friends. The violence simmering in polite society. And once you've seen such things you cannot look away. Part 2. Paris was roaring at the turn of the century. The cafés of Montmartre shook with the laughter of cabaret, the ringing of glasses, the heated arguments of poets, painters and anarchists. And yet, in a modest studio, Felix Vallotton sat in silence. No music. No chatter. Only the sharp sound of a knife cutting into wood. Because Vallotton had found his true voice, not in oil, not in color, but in black and white woodcuts. The knife and the block. To carve a woodcut is to embrace both violence and control. Every stroke of the blade is irreversible. There is no blur, no softness, no haze. Only black, and the absence of it. And that suited Vallotton perfectly. His prints were unlike anything Paris had ever seen. Crowds in the boulevards reduced to a single, writhing shadow. Policemen with brutal silhouettes looming over faceless protesters. A couple in bed, their bodies locked not in tenderness, but in suffocating tension. Each work was a knife to the illusions of polite society. Vallotton's woodcuts became wildly popular. Newspapers reproduced them, critics praised them. Overnight, he became the visual voice of the fin de siècle, the end of the 19th century. But there was danger in that success. Because while Impressionists chased beauty, Vallotton chased truth, and truth, when laid bare, can look monstrous. Les Nabis, the brotherhood of the new art. It was around this time that Vallotton was drawn into a circle of painters calling themselves Les Nabis, the prophets. They were radicals, visionaries who wanted to push painting beyond Impressionism into something more spiritual, more symbolic. Here were names like Pierre Bonnard, Edouard Vuillard, and Maurice Denis. Artists who painted intimate interiors, patterned surfaces, glowing colors. Vallotton joined them, but never quite belonged. Where Bonnard painted warmth and domestic tenderness, Vallotton painted icy distance. Where Vuillard celebrated the intimacy of lovers, Vallotton painted their silences, their mistrust. Still the group gave him a stage. And for a time Vallotton flourished. His works appeared in avant-garde journals, his prints circulated across Europe. Yet beneath the success there was unease. Whispers spread in the salons of Paris. Is Vallotton one of us? Or is he merely dissecting us with his cold little scalpel? Because to many Felix's art felt not like celebration, but like accusation. The double-edged success. By the 1890s, Vallotton was not just a painter, not just a printmaker, he was a mirror held up to society. And society did not always like what it saw. His images of police violence during demonstrations shocked the bourgeoisie. His depictions of lovers seemed less erotic than suffocating. His portraits, precise and unforgiving, left no room for vanity. And then came his most unsettling series, Intimacies. 10 woodcuts, each showing the private world of bourgeois couples. A man slipping money into a woman's hand. A husband lurking in the doorway as his wife entertains another. A wife turning her back to her husband's desperate embrace. No scandalous nudity. No melodrama. Just truth. Cold, merciless truth. Critics were divided. Some called him a genius. Others whispered that Vallotton must hate people, that he painted humanity as if it were diseased. And perhaps in some way they were right. Because the more Vallotton carved into his woodblocks, the more he seemed to carve into himself. Into his own doubts, his own isolation, his own inability to love without distance. The outsider. Even among the avant-garde, Vallotton remained an outsider. Too Swiss for the Parisians. Too Parisian for the Swiss. Too cold for the Impressionists. Too realist for the symbolists. And yet he couldn't stop. The knife. The block. The silence of his studio. It was as if he were possessed, driven by a need to reveal what others refused to see. His reputation grew, but so did his loneliness. Friends described him as witty, charming in conversation. But behind the charm was a wall. A sense that Vallotton was always observing, never belonging. One friend wrote, "Felix is like a mirror that reflects all but absorbs nothing. He knows us better than we know ourselves. And that is why we fear him." Part 3. The Marriage of Convenience or the Marriage of Salvation. In 1899, at the age of 34, Felix Vallotton did something unexpected. He married Gabrielle Rodriguez Henriquez, the daughter of a wealthy art dealer. On paper it looked like salvation. No more worries about money. No more wondering if his next woodcut would sell. He suddenly had access to collectors, galleries, and the bourgeois society he had so often mocked with his art. But was it love? Some said no. Some whispered that Vallotton had married for comfort, for position, for stability. And perhaps at least partly that was true. But if so, it came at a price. Because the bourgeois salons he now frequented were the same ones he had once dissected with merciless precision. The same dinners. The same false smiles. The same suffocating rituals of polite society. And Felix Vallotton, who had once been the cold observer of these games, was now inside them. The cold fire of painting. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was rebellion. But after his marriage, Vallotton's art began to shift. The woodcuts that had made him famous, brutal, simple, merciless, gave way to painting. Large, ambitious canvases. Mythological scenes, historical dramas, landscapes. But something was off. The public admired his technique, his smooth surfaces, his sharp outlines. Yet there was always a chill in them, a sense of detachment. A reclining nude that should have radiated warmth instead looked like marble. A pastoral landscape glowed with sunlight, but the trees stood as if frozen in time. Even his portraits carried that eerie Vallotton stillness, as if his subjects had been caught not in life, but in an eternal pause. Critics called his style unsettling realism. It was beautiful but uncanny. As though Vallotton was painting the world not as it was, but as some distant god might see it, precise, perfect, and utterly without comfort. The world on fire. Then came the 1910s. The air in Europe was heavy with fear. Revolutions in the streets. Assassinations. The storm clouds of war gathering. And Vallotton felt it. His paintings grew darker, heavier. He abandoned the playfulness of les Nabis entirely. He returned again and again to the human body, not in passion but in conflict. Lovers locked not in embraces but in struggles. Then in 1914 the Great War erupted. Vallotton, already in his 50s, could not fight. But he could see. He was commissioned as a war artist. And what he produced was unlike anything before. Where others painted the glory of battle, Vallotton painted landscapes scarred by bombs. Where others painted heroism, Vallotton painted emptiness. Where others painted soldiers, Vallotton painted the silence after the soldiers were gone. His war canvases are eerie, almost abstract. A sky of red over a field of black. A forest shredded by artillery, its trees like broken bones. A horizon that looks less like land and more like a wound. They were not propaganda. They were visions. And they terrified those who saw them. The man behind the silence. And yet, behind all of this, what of the man himself? Friends recalled Vallotton as both witty and impenetrable. He could laugh, he could charm, but even in joy his eyes seemed to analyze, to measure, to judge. His marriage endured, but without passion. His career was steady, but without warmth. And perhaps that was Vallotton's curse. That the same coldness which gave him clarity as an artist robbed him of comfort as a man. One friend wrote, near the end of his life, Felix loved truth more than he loved happiness. And truth, once uncovered, rarely forgives. Part 4. The Slow Fade. By the 1920s, Felix Vallotton was a man divided. On one side he was celebrated. Galleries hung his paintings. Collectors fought for his canvases. His name was written beside the great artists of his time. On the other side he was quietly eroding. Inside his health began to fail. The sharp lines of his art hid the fact that his own body was slowly collapsing. He worked relentlessly as if he knew time was running short. Each painting became heavier, quieter, more stripped of illusion. His landscapes no longer showed beauty, they showed silence. Silent fields. Silent skies. Silent rivers. As though the world itself were waiting for something it could not name. The hospital window. In 1925, Felix Vallotton underwent surgery for cancer. The operation left him weakened, confined. And yet, even from the hospital bed he painted. From his window, he captured the rooftops of Paris, not with romance, not with light, but with that same chilling stillness that had haunted his entire career. The chimneys stood like grave markers. The sky glowed with a pale, uncanny light. It was Paris, yes. But it was also a vision of the city as seen by someone on the threshold of another world. The last canvas. They say his final works carried an almost supernatural detachment. He painted as though he had already stepped 1 foot beyond the border of life. Figures that should have been alive looked like ghosts. Skies that should have shone looked like veils. Every stroke was a farewell. On December 29, 1925, Felix Vallotton died. He was 60 years old. No great funeral, no national mourning. Just a quiet passing. A man whose life had been about silence, ended in silence. The legacy of the watcher. And yet, his art remained. Those woodcuts, stark and merciless, still cut like knives. Those paintings, with their frozen figures and unsettling calm, still disturb. To look at a Vallotton canvas is to feel watched. As though the painter's cold, sharp eyes are still measuring you, stripping you bare, even from the grave. His legacy is not comfort. It is not beauty in the conventional sense. It is something far more enduring, far more unsettling. Truth without mercy. The final whisper. And so the story of Felix Vallotton ends. With a whisper, with a shadow, with a canvas that stares back at you. Even now, nearly a century later, his art feels alive. Alive not because it comforts but because it refuses to let us look away. He was the painter of silence. The artist of stillness. The man who saw the world without illusions. And perhaps that is why his art will never die. Because silence, in the end, speaks louder than any scream.